It's a lake with water in it, and my friend like stalked me because we were like camping, and I was like sitting at the edge of this lake, and I was praying, and then like 3 days later, she was like, "I got this good picture of you," and I was like, "That's not intrusive at all into my personal life. Thanks." Yeah. So, anyways, we're waiting for Daniel to make sure that everything is going good right there.
It's red right now.
It's red right now.
That's a good sign.
Well, probably. We're live. Yeah, see what he says. How's everyone's week? Eh? Bad for Mac. A is here. Bad is here. What? You're giving me conflicting signals.
I would say that
It wasn't boring and it wasn't great.
It's like you're like this location.
yeah, it should be good. I'm gonna pull it up real quick to make sure it's all good, but you can start.
Okay, cool. Daniel said I could start. He's in charge, so that's what I'll do. Anyways, okay, guys. So here we go. Today is the beginning of December, and I'm going to be doing a message about Santa Claus. And then next week, Miss Deanna is going to be doing a message about like the actual story of Christmas, but this one's more fun, so I took it. In this, if you see, it's the true story of Saint Nick, or the mostly true story. I'm going to be telling 2 stories about Saint Nick, and these 2 stories are like the most attested to, the ones that are the earliest, and the ones that are most probably true. Though, if we're being honest, over time, people probably added a couple things or took some things away, okay? That's okay, because I'm going to be paraphrasing them anyways. So, how many of you guys actually know that there is an actual Saint Nick the person? Yes? Does anybody know what he's the saint of? It's a lot of things. He's the saint of Russia. He's also the saint of Greece. And he's the saint of unmarried women, children, and sailors who are drowning.
Yep.
Where'd you find that information?
It's the Catholic Church. They're the ones that keep it. Okay. So anyways, so one of the this actual sidelight has nothing on it. I just didn't know what to put there, and I needed a place. So the first story, the big one of Saint Nick, actually starts when he's born, and so he's born to a really, really wealthy family, probably a trading family on the coast of Turkey. And as good trading families in that area, they make tons of money, and they're probably one of the richest 2 or 3 families in the city. And they're Christians. And as Saint Nick is growing older, and he gets into his teen years, he kind of has that moment that I think all of us have probably had at one point, where you go, well, my parents are like, they're cool and stuff. Maybe maybe they're not, but I think my parents are pretty cool, but they don't know everything. And if you don't know that at the moment, you'll learn it eventually. Your parents don't know everything; they do know a lot of things. But one thing that Saint Nick says is what it was saying is that he thinks that his parents weren't being generous with their wealth or honoring their wealth that God gave them very well. He basically said that he thought that they were using their wealth like non-Christians do. Okay? Now, that wouldn't be a problem normally, except for when he was a late teenager, his parents died and left him all of their wealth because he was their only kid. And then he was faced with the problem of having all of the wealth. And as you might know, there's this problem that people are really good at saying, wow, that thing, people should do this with that thing that they have. And as soon as you get it, it's a lot harder, right? It's a lot harder to actually put it into action and practice when you're the person that has it. But Saint Nick actually starts being very generous, which is kind of crazy because at the time, generosity still wasn't a widespread good thing. People were great, loved it when you gave them things, but it was actually among the hoi polloi, among the big people, the people who had money, giving charity to people was kind of considered a weakness. It wasn't really considered a good thing. This is back in like the late 200s AD, okay? So Christianity's still not that big, and charity hasn't really expanded very much, and Romans don't really think it's very important or actually a good thing. Okay, really quick, I'm gonna pause. Does anybody know what a dowry is? Raise your hand if you know what a dowry is. Okay, it's a big word, so I'm gonna explain it really quick. A dowry is a sum of money that the parents of a daughter pay to kind of the husband when their daughter gets married. It's usually used to buy a house, okay, or to fund the buying of a house when they first get married, which means it's a lot of money, right? If you imagine how much money your parents would have to have if they were like, well, my daughter's getting married, time to give them enough money to buy a house to start with. It's a lot of money. It's not something that everyone has. And in the Roman world, it was really hard to get married if you didn't have a dowry, okay? So if your parents weren't able to afford one, it was really difficult for you as a woman to get married. And what would happen is if you didn't get married by the time you were about 30 or so, if your parents died, your only option was to sell yourself into slavery so that you weren't on the streets. Okay, so that's important. If you don't have a dowry, that's pretty much the end of a woman. If she has to sell herself into slavery once her parents die if she doesn't have a dowry. So it's a big deal. Okay, so Saint Nick, living in this little city, would walk by on morning walks, praying and stuff like that, or going to church or whatever. So as he was walking, one day he kind of overheard this woman crying to her dad through an open window. And as he's walking by, he hears her crying about not having a dowry, and so she can't get married because the person she wants to marry, their parents won't let him get married until there's a dowry, and they just don't have one because they're a poor family. So she's crying, and Saint Nick kind of goes on, and then later that day he circles back to his house. He grabs a bag of gold, and in the middle of the night, he cracks open a window, chucks the bag of gold through secretly, and he leaves. Okay, so what? Okay, maybe he runs after he chucks the bag of gold. He's like, get gone. Okay, so he chucks his bag of gold in, and he gets gone so that no one knows who gave the gold. Okay, now in that, he goes back the next day, because even if you want to be secret about the good things that you do, sometimes you want to hear people be happy, right? Like, it's cool to hear other people be happy, especially when you help out, even if you don't really want to know who it is, like them to know who gave the stuff. So as he's passing by the next day, expecting to hear this daughter rejoicing, instead he hears another daughter crying. And this daughter is going, "Father, why does she get a dowry just because she's older and I don't?" And so as he hears this crying, he's got a ton of money, so he sneaks back around, he goes to his house, and in the middle of the night, he goes back, cracks open the window, chucks the bag of gold in, and he runs. Okay? Now, the next morning, what do you guys think happens? He goes back to see. Oh, I wonder how she's, how it's going. So he goes back, makes sure they get the bag of gold and whatever, hearing the happiness, and instead, he hears a third daughter crying. Okay? Now, his third daughter, he's like, oh my goodness. And it's a really good thing that he has a ton of money that he can do this with. So he goes back to do the exact same thing again. But this time, as he goes back, he's creeping up, and he sees the dad hiding in the house. I'm going to guess, trying to figure out who's throwing bags of gold into his window. Because these things don't just show up. So he's like, Saint Nick is like, well, I want to be secretive. I don't want people to know the good that I'm doing for them. I just want to do it, right? And so he goes back around, he sneaks back around the house, he climbs on the roof, and he drops the third bag of gold into the chimney. Okay, now, this is the actual legend. So the actual legend goes with that, especially in a port city, you would dry out your socks inside the fireplace. So the fireplace would be really big, and you'd hang your socks up, right, in the back of the fireplace. So legend goes, and we're being honest, this probably didn't happen, but legend goes that he dropped the bag in, and it landed inside one of those stockings.
Good shot.
And that's why we have stockings today for Christmas, is because the bag of gold dropped in the stocking, okay? So, and that way, no one ever knew at the time what he had done. So then he goes back the third day, and there are no more daughters, thank goodness, because of that poor father. And he didn't have to pay any more money to people. Yeah, I just imagine this guy being like, wow, we've got 3 bags of gold. I really wish, I hope there's another bag of gold for the parents, coming through the window or something. So anyways, with that, I think what that story really illustrates is, number one, generosity, and number two, kind of using your wealth well, right? Like last week, we talked about the parable of the talents, and we talked about using your wealth and your talents well for others. And we said it could be wealth, it could be other things. And in that story, one of the things about using your wealth well was building it up. But another way to use your wealth well is to give it away to people, right? You don't only have to sell it. You don't have to make money with it. The Christian idea, a lot of it is to give it away. Does anybody know what the word agape is?
Yes.
Okay. So the agape, a lot of people would say it's unconditional love. It is used in that way, but it actually means charitable love. It's love that you give without expecting anything back. Okay? So that's what this is. This is him giving agape love. This one of the better kinds of love in Greek thought. So I connected this to 1 Timothy 6. If you have your Bibles, you can grab them, or you can just read it off of this, because the words are kind of biggish. So 1 Timothy 6, this is the end of the book to Timothy that Paul's writing. Timothy is like his protege who's living in Ephesus when he writes this letter to him. And this is actually his almost closing remark. It's like 2 verses away from the last thing he says. He says, "Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life." Okay, so have you ever heard laying up treasures in heaven? Ever heard that idea? That kind of comes from this thing as well, right? That's one of the ways to translate this is laying up treasures in heaven. And this idea is that the good things we do, and the money that we give to others, and the charity that we give to others, if we're really loud about it, Jesus says that's going to be our reward will be people, giving us accolades for it. But if we do it in secret, that's how we lay up treasures in heaven. If we do good without expecting good in return, that's how we lay up treasures in heaven. Okay? And I think that's really, St. Nick is perfectly exemplifying this. He's a rich person who's not letting his riches go to his head. He's not finding his security in his wealth. He's not being like, well, I'm safe because I have lots of money, right? Because he's being generous with it. And I think in a lot of ways, the way that we don't start trusting money over other things is we start being generous with it, right? If you're generous with it, then you won't rely upon it in the same way as if you hoard it like Scrooge McDuck, right? Diving into all the money. But with that, it also says, to be rich in good deeds and generous, willing to share, and doing good. Which I think is just, all 3 of those things are 3 really good things that we should be thinking about doing. How can we do good to others? How can we be generous and willing to share and doing good deeds for others, right? Okay, so I'm going to do a really, really hard switch into this next story, which is completely different, about St. Nick punching a guy. So, St. Nick, so he becomes a bishop of a place called, it's like Myrna or Mira or something. And as he's the bishop of this, he's like the head of the church in this city. This is probably like about 15, 20 years after the original story, okay? So he's an older guy now. He's the bishop, he's a leader in a church, and he gets invited to this thing called the Nicene Creed, okay? Which is right there. It's really small, but it's right there. That statement is made in 325 AD, and it's a statement, if you haven't read it, you should look it up later, and you should read it, because it's basically all Christians believe this, all Christians believe this, all Christians believe this, all the way down. It's a very good little statement to read, okay? In that, he was invited to come write this. He was invited by a bunch of people, with a bunch of other people, to come write this creed and be like, all Christians should believe these things to be Christians, okay? Now, there were some other people invited, and a lot of people that were invited didn't agree with this whole thing, or a few people did. There's this guy named Arius. Has anybody ever heard of Arianism? Okay, so Arianism is a heresy, which means it's something that is definitely not true. You don't believe it if you're a Christian. And Arianism's basic belief is that Jesus is less than God and a created being. That God created Jesus at some point. Okay, that's Arianism. It's not true. You go home and you tell your parents, Jake, talk about Arianism. No, did not say that God created Jesus. God did not create Jesus. But that's the debate, one of the big debates that they're having here. And this guy named Arius, who Arianism is named after, starts like talking about this constantly. He's trying to convince everybody. Like, this is true, this is true, this is true, this is true. God created Jesus. God created Jesus. God created Jesus. And at some point, St. Nick got so fed up that he just walked up to him and punched him in the face.
Awesome.
And told him to shut his mouth and stop lying. Now, I'm not telling you to punch people in the faces when you disagree with them. But,
Seriously.
At this point, St. Nick gets picked up and thrown out of the council. They tell him he can't come back because he punched someone. Violence isn't okay. You know, we're all Christians here. Stop punching people. Now, so he's kicked out, probably pretty bummed, not super happy. So all of the leaders of the council, I'll say this, there are lots of different versions of this story of who got visions. The one that I think is probably most reliable is the one that says, all of the leaders of the council had a dream in the night. The dream had Jesus come in the dream and say, basically, my paraphrase, St. Nick is right, put him back in and kick out Arius. Which, as we can say, we it'd be like, wow, that seems like a fantastical story, except for they actually do end up doing that. They kick out Arius and they bring St. Nick back. And I don't have another explanation for why they would do that, personally. Okay? So they bring St. Nick back. St. Nick helps craft this, and we as a Christian creed, have this thing that says Jesus is the Son of God. Okay? So what I think that this really shows an emphasis towards is actually the next two verses of 1 Timothy. Now, these are the last two verses of 1 Timothy that Paul writes to Timothy in the church of Ephesus. He says, Timothy, guard what has been entrusted to your care. Turn away from godless chatter and the opposing ideas of what is falsely called knowledge, which some have professed, and in so doing have departed from the faith. Now, Paul is actually probably talking about another heresy, not Arianism. Okay, he's talking about another thing, saying that would have said that Jesus didn't have a physical body. That's what he's probably talking about. But I think we can still use this and go, we need to guard the truth that we've been given. And what that looks like is that doesn't look like, when someone says something, it doesn't actually look like punching them in the face, right? But what it does look like is it does look like knowing the truth and being able to defend the truth, usually verbally. Okay? It looks like knowing the truth well enough to know when something else is wrong, right? If someone came up to you and said, well, Jesus is never coming back, you'd be able to go, I don't think that is true. And I'm going to say, you're saying that's not a very Christian thing to say, right? That's guarding truth. That's not going, oh, that's okay. We can all think that in the big umbrella, right? There's actually Christians, and I actually had an argument with my professor about this at seminary, and he was saying we need to have, understand that there are Christians in Asia that believe that Buddhism is also correct. Right? And I was like, that doesn't sound like guarding the truth that we've been entrusted with. If someone came up to me and was like, hey, I think that Jesus is a way and Buddha is a way, I'd go, I don't think that's true. And I think we can look at the Bible and see that that's pretty much easily not true, right? So what we have to be able to do is we have to be able to be prepared, but also be willing to say when things are wrong, right? Who likes confronting people when they think that they're wrong? Raise your hand if you like confronting people when they are wrong. Okay, thank you. So it's a minority of the room, right? Okay. Are you pointing at me? Okay, actually, fun fact, I do not like confrontation very much. I like debating, but I don't like telling people they're wrong very much. It really.
Yeah, you still do it.
Yes. I'm just trying to follow the Bible, Matthew. So, in that, we have to be willing to be able to take that step of, hey, this isn't okay. This is wrong. And we have to be able to do that in such a way that doesn't compromise the other thing that Paul tells Timothy, right? Yeah. So, what I want to get at is this. What we do will empower what we say. If you've ever heard the line, I'm going to disagree with this, so don't think it's true, because it's not. You ever heard the line that says, I speak with my actions? Yeah, that's true, but you also should speak with words. God gave you a mouth and hands, you should use both of them. You shouldn't only speak with your hands, because no one will know what you're speaking, right? If I go do charity every day for a year, but I never say anything about Christ, they'll go, wow, he's doing that because he's a great person, right? And that's not what I'm trying to communicate. So you have to use your hands and your mouth. We must stick to the truth, but we have to be loving and generous and kind to others at the same time. So St. Nick doesn't entirely exemplify the being loving and gentle and kind and generous and kind to Arius very well. But I think what he does exemplify is being generous and kind and loving to people, which is what got him to be in a place where he could speak the truth to people, to people who were making decisions, right? If he wasn't kind and generous and loving, he probably wouldn't have ever become the bishop of Myra, right? He probably wouldn't have ever been in that position. But being all of these good things got him into the position to be able to give truth to people, right? At the same time, people will take us more seriously if you're doing good, right? If you critique someone, people are much more likely to take your critique seriously if you're not a tool, right? Like if you are just a jerk all the time, if you're cutting people off in traffic, and like you have a friend in the car, you're driving, you cut people off in traffic, and you honk all the time, and you're like cussing out the window at people, right? If you're doing that, and then you're like, wow, I just think people should be kinder to each other. Your friend will be like, wow, what are you doing, right? So, and in that same way, if you are, you have a serious question?
I have a statement.
I agree with your statement.
It's only road rage when I get out of the car.
Yes.
Okay,
And
so,
to be fair, when the motorcycle is passing you on a double yellow and he's like car locked up for the past 10 cars, kind of deserves a honk.
Exactly.
that's true. So, but with that,
We'll say God bless him.
so with, well, and that's one of the things, actually, if we go back to Janelle's message a while ago, kindness versus niceness,
Oh, yeah.
honking isn't necessarily mean. Honking because someone's being dangerous is kind. Honking because you're mad at someone is not so good, right? And that's like kind of the same thing going on here is, if we are kind and generous and loving in our lives and we're doing good deeds, people will be able to take us more seriously. We're going to talk more about that in small groups, okay? So, I'm not saying that these stories about St. Nick are entirely 100% true. I think there's probably a lot of story that goes along with it. There are some other stories about St. Nick. Apparently, St. Nick, as a baby, would only eat on Mondays and Tuesdays and fast the other 5 days.
What
I
the
didn't think that story was
No,
true,
that's not
so I didn't talk about it.
Did he choose or did his parents make it?
I think the story says he chose. So there's all these other stories about St. Nick. I think these ones are probably the ones that we can take the most truly, but even then, stories are good for us to look at and say, how can we implement that in our own lives in some kind of way, okay? So I'm going to pray for us, and then we're going to break up to small groups, okay? Everyone bow your heads and close your eyes. Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for great stories, like the story of St. Nick. Lord, thank you for empowering us and your people to do good deeds and do deeds that we wouldn't even think of if we weren't Christians, Lord. Thank you for bringing to our mind good things for us to do and for empowering us to do them. Please help us to work in growing in goodness and generosity and loving and good deeds towards others so that we can be a good witness for truth and for you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Right way.
Did I say it the right way?
You did. You said it.
Oh my gosh, I did it twice now. I hate everything. And then bow your heads and close your eyes.
All right, middle school girls, you got something.
Which one?
T-Y-H. You would have said T-Y-H.
I don't know what you're talking about.